Okay, so I've seen some comments about keystone scaling and the key squish being absolutely nuclear the past couple of weeks, and kind of talking about how this new season of Mythic Plus feels way harder than past seasons of Mythic Plus. And whenever you look at it in isolation, there's a couple of key breakpoints in which, keystones just straight up are probably harder than they have been in the past. I will say that part of this problem is players expecting to be able to do like high level keys, right? Or they might be a little bit in over their head in terms of what their actual skill is necessarily going to be, because they look at the key and they say, I could probably do a 10, when in reality, it takes like a lot of coordination and pretty high item level to do a 10. But for some players, that's not necessarily true. And part of it too is just doing a 10 this season is actually relatively hard. And there are actually 3 breakpoints in which keys get pretty noticeably harder. The first key level at which this is apparent, at least for me, is the key level going from a 6 to a 7. That's when the challenger's peril is actually added in. And basically what this does is it moves your death penalty from 5 seconds to 15 seconds. And this kind of looks innocuous on the surface. And whenever I was talking about my reaction to some of the changes to Mythic Plus, I actually didn't expect this to be super important, because whenever you're like, trying to like actually prog a key or push a key, very infrequently do you rack up a bunch of deaths. Now, early on in seasons, this isn't necessarily true, especially whenever you're going for completion for weeklies or whatnot. And so going from a 6 to a 7, this creates this kind of dynamic where if you wipe one time, you're probably depleting the key because you end up paying over a minute in death penalties, which is actually brutal. And so actually being able to save those deaths in some aspects is kind of important. And so, because pretty infrequently do you actually have, a minute 15 or whatever it is in death in timer to actually be able to salvage, plus a run back, plus whatever other time loss that was incurred via the deaths. So the challenger's peril, whenever that happens, it's actually brutal. And so going from a 6 to a 7 for some players actually becomes a bit tedious. The next one, and this is probably the most common level that's complained about, is the 9 to the 10 level. This is when Tyrannical and Fortified both come active at the same time. So whichever affix is not active on the level 4 level, the other one is going to be active on the level 10 level. And so we can actually take a look here at the scaling, where the percent modifier is 114% at 9, and it's 136 at 10. This is obviously standard scaling, but then you get a multiplicative 20% or 25% bonus on top of that, depending on which one's going to be active, whether it be Fortified or Tyrannical. And these things scale multiplicatively. So you have the Fortified already on the key, and then you end up getting the Tyrannical, which then ends up increasing the boss timer. It increases the amount of damage that you're going to be dealt to you via bosses and whatnot. And vice versa is true with Fortified, where on a 9, the trash actually can explode like it did in previous seasons whenever it's Tyrannical baseline. But then you move up to a 10, and then you end up getting Fortified added in the mix, and the trash is a hell of a lot more deadly. It has a ton more HP, and then it becomes a lot more dangerous. And then in conjunction with the challenger's peril, you can't afford deaths, right? So going from a 9 to a 10, that's about the level that's, I would say, puggable once you're about 620 item level. But the problem is skill matters so much more in this situation than it has in the past. In the past, things like meta DPS or being able to do optimal output mattered a lot more. Whereas this season, particularly for 10s, not dying is probably the most crucial thing that you can actually do here. And this is a lot more bring the player, not the class centric than it has been in the past, at least for pugging keys, where trying to get your weeklies done, getting that 10 done, it's not necessarily about who can do the most damage, but about who can die the least. And I think that that's something that sometimes will go over players' heads, and that's why you kind of scouting out the players that are the most important, scouting out the players that are the best is the most important thing. And the last level that matters, and this is only for like the sweaty tryhards, the sweaty elitists that are looking to push keys and looking to push for titles. So I suspect that most people aren't going to end up worrying about this, but I'm going to rant about it a little bit because it's obviously affecting me, is the move from 11 to 12. Now, the move from 11 to 12, you end up getting this Zalatath's Guile. What this does is it increases the health and damage dealt by the mobs by 20%. And how this actually feels to play is you have more than enough damage to be able to time pretty much every key. Like if you take a look here, there are keys that are even being timed on 14s that are 3 minutes under. You were 2 minutes under on this 14 mists. There were 3 minutes under on an Arakara. There's a bunch of 13s, 14s, 12s that are being timed. So it's possible in terms of damage output. Now, the issue is that you're going to get white swung to death, more or less, where your tank, it's actually nearly impossible to be able to live these level of keys with tank survivability right now. Whenever we played these on beta, they didn't actually have the 20% damage modifier in, and so we weren't able to appropriately give feedback on this. They only had the 20% health in, which we think is fine. Now, does it make bosses really long? Yeah, bosses ended up being about 3.5 minutes. Because similar to how, whenever you add the fortified or the tyrannical in, it's multiplicative scaling, right? Going from 11 to a 12, it's like another 30-ish% jump, but then you have multiplicatively 20% damage and healing on top of that. So it's 20% multiply onto the base of the key, which obviously makes it so much harder for obvious reasons. And then that creates a situation where your tank just gets auto attacked to death by the mobs, and you don't get the bargain, which is honestly probably fine. Like, you don't really care too much about the bargain. The bargain is a bit of a time gain in most instances, not all, but most instances it's a little bit of a time gain because the buff that you're getting is quite powerful, but sometimes it could be obnoxious. I think these probably offset one another, all things considered, but just this guile buff is absolutely nuclear. And so these 3 breakpoints for keys are the ones that are seeing the most difficult challenge, where you end up having to prog, depending on the player, a lot of your keys moving from a 6 to a 7, where you're no longer allowed to have deaths, and that just becomes absolutely insane. And from a 9 to a 10, this is probably the one that players have struggled with the most, is also getting their weekly keys done, because they changed the weekly drop rewards. Okay, this page doesn't necessarily have it. Here it is. They changed the weekly drop rewards, where the first stage of the vault that drops myth tracker gear out of your vault is actually a 10. And so you have to be able to actually complete the 10, not necessarily in time, but complete the 10, to be able to get this myth track gear out of the vault. So 10 is obviously the chase for most players. And so going from that 9 to that 10 has been a lot more of a struggle than it has been in the past. But whenever you look at it in the sense of, this is kind of similar to going from a 19 to a 20 in the previous system. If you remember Dragonflight Season 1, going from a 19 to a 20 was really hard. Actually doing 20s, especially early on in the season, was nuclear. But I think that the concept in players' heads of going from a 9 to a 10, you feel like, I should be able to do a 10, but they have a lot of added difficulty here. So from Blizzard's perspective, and I think that Squishy talked about this on the most recent episode of the Bench podcast, we were kind of talking about it a little bit. He said that he thinks this is all intentional, right? That they're trying to add in all this added difficulty all at once and balance it around these keystone breakpoints, where you're going from a 6 to a 7. This is where you're actually able to get hero track gear as end of dungeon rewards. Then you're going from a 9 to a 10. This is the first step at which you're able to get myth as vault rewards. And then 11 to a 12. That's like the sweaty, try-hard, elitist POV, where you're looking to go, and do the highest level of keys that are possible for the season. And the guile is just, frankly, very hard. And so his speculation, and I think that it's kind of true, is that the keys are just like intentionally meant to be super hard, and that delves are supposed to be for some of the players that aren't interacting with the Mythic Plus system at all, right? Where delves are like this bridge between M0s and Mythic Plus, and then Mythic Plus starts at like a 2. I will say one good thing about the squish, just in general, is that I've seen a lot more 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s in Group Finder, right? Where in the past, you wouldn't actually see these lower level keys, but now you're seeing a more representative amount of keys that are in Group Finder that showcase like how many different levels of play are actually available to players. Now, I will say that there's a lot of keys that end up getting bottlenecked at this 7 level. There's a lot of keys that get bottlenecked at this 10 level. And there's a lot of keys that get bottlenecked at this 12 level, where a lot of friends that I know are basically just trying to prog 12 keys right now. But I've seen a lot of people come in my chat whenever I'm streaming, and they're like, dude, keys are super nuclear this season. I'm getting bottlenecked at like a 10. And so it's definitely happening to a lot of people that are just in general struggling. So I just kind of wanted to make this video kind of talk about why that's happening, you know, why the keystone squish and why this new key system that we're having this season has been so difficult for players. And just to let you know, you're not necessarily alone. This is happening to a lot of people. I wouldn't worry about it too much. Just as some final thoughts, the best thing that you can do, especially if you're trying to do 7s, and especially if you're trying to do 10s, like this is doubly true if you're trying to do 10s, I would be looking at what players are applying to your group, and instead of bringing the class like you have in the past, bring the player that's going to die the least. Bring the player that seems like they're the most accomplished. Bring the player that seems like they really know what's kind of up going on with the dungeons, and they really know the mechanics, because ultimately at the end of the day, not dying is going to be by far your biggest time save, and increase your likelihood of being able to actually time these keys on a 10, allow you to get your portals, allow you to get your weekly vault filled. That way you can end up getting that myth track gear that you so heavily covet, because this is going to be a long season, and myth track gear is maybe a little bit less plentiful than it necessarily has been in the past, especially for Mythic Plus only players. So your crafted gear is going to be valuable. Your myth track gear that you can potentially get from the vault, especially if you are doing these 10s, it's going to be very valuable. And so making sure that you're able to get a bunch of those 10s done to be able to fill out your vault is going to be super important. And for the players that are looking to go for 11, 12, first off, you're probably a title range pusher, title key pusher, 0.1% title, looking to get that kind of thing. So congratulations. But also know that the system's kind of bullshit for you. That the guile is absolutely insane, and you're gonna actually have to prog 12s. Like straight up, you're gonna have to prog 12s. The title keys are probably going to be somewhere in like the 15 range towards later part of the season, especially whenever players end up getting a lot more gear. So you're gonna have to prog them at some point, and they're gonna be hard. Straight up, you can't afford deaths, basically. It's not that they are challenging on the timer. As you can see, people are timing them 3 minutes under the timer. But they are challenging in the sense of, if you have any deaths, you get punished more so than in the past. And this kind of creates this situation where holding W, playing conservatively, and doing that kind of thing is going to be the most valuable thing that you can possibly do in these dungeons. It's just making sure that your group knows what's going to go up, go down, and you're very predictable in how you're pulling, what you're doing, what you're using defensively, making sure that you have like really strong defensive play just in general. Those are probably some of the more important things just in general. If you want a tip, invite a Frost Death Knight. That spec can't die, and I don't even think they could kill themselves if they necessarily tried. AMS and 20% bonus health, they are basically invulnerable to death. So invite more Frost Death Knights. That's probably your best bet. Anyhow, if you like this kind of content, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Additionally, come check out my stream. I've been streaming a lot lately. Been streaming trying to do 12 keys, because 12 is, again, absolutely bonkers. So come check out my stream as well. And leave a comment. I've been looking for good video ideas, and so if you guys have good video ideas for the future, please leave a comment, because I need some more nice video ideas. And you guys commented this on my most recent video, talking about the dungeon squish, about how it's been just like so challenging for you guys. And so I want to make content that the players want. Anyways, goodbye.